Hi everyone, Justin here of Justin Speaks in Tongues. Speaks in Tongues, of course, referring to language learning and the acquisition of second languages, as we will be talking about today. When one discusses the topic of second language acquisition or learning a second language, there are many different ways to approach that and many different theories that can come up. And among those, the kind of standout topics that have come up over the past 30 years especially is the topic of comprehensible input. There are all kinds of websites and YouTube channels and different things dedicated to discussing this topic. One of the most famous, one of the most popular on YouTube is Matt vs. Japan and the Refold method, which was previously went under another name, but currently is going by Refold. And this has to do with getting a lot of input within language learning. But the way that typically is discussed within those communities is that there will be kind of some way of working with the language that usually relies on media through like watching television or listening to podcasts or something like that. Television, especially for Japanese learners, the use of anime seems to be the standout one, and getting vocabulary, which is then reviewed through flashcard systems like Anki. But if you really go back and look at some of the research that Krashen did on this, there's another guy named Long that goes into quite a bit of detail on what type of comprehensible input one should be obtaining, or ideal ways that one can get comprehensible input. And Long's theory is a theory of interaction. So whereas Krashen's comprehensible input theory essentially only states that you need to understand messages, that when you hear something in another language and you understand the message that is being communicated in that language, that is when language learning takes place. That is when the adaptation or the acquisition of that language begins, or that it takes place in that moment. So Long's theory is a bit more specific though, and says that ideally that when language learning really takes place is when there is interaction with another person. So this is another aspect, another layer of understanding. So contrary to like kind of the Refold method, or not contrary to it, but going beyond just that, the idea that you can be interacting with another person, that this is a whole nother level, that this is a much more ideal situation. And as second language teachers, or English as a second language teachers, which we may be in school, so I am studying to be a ESL teacher, this is something that can be very effectively and very much more easily input or implemented in a classroom than, say, somebody who wants to learn a foreign language, but they have no easy, regular way of interacting with a person that is a native speaker of that language. So even when we look at Krashen's theories or his research that was done on comprehensible input, the kind of the earliest, the major studies coming out in around 1981, you see that when he cites research, he cites different instances and case studies where people were effective language learners. He often is citing information that relies on input. So he actually, in his 1981 study on comprehensible input, where there's a published document which you can find at his website for free, but he cites this interaction between both a successful second language learner, English second language learner, and a unsuccessful language learner. But in the successful version, an adult speaks with a young boy named Paul. And the adult says, "Paul, are you writing?" And Paul says, "Yeah." The adult says, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm right." It's like W-R-I-T-E, like I'm right. So he's using not the so it's missing. You normally would say I'm writing. He just says I'm right. "Paul, are you writing?" So the teacher, the adult, in a way corrects him without correcting him. He gives him the language that he wants, and Paul says, "Yeah." The adult then repeats himself and says, "What are you doing?" And then Paul correctly says, "I'm writing." So this has to do with a way that you have this corrective, immediate interaction that takes place. And so then, the dialogue continues. He says, is the baby crying? And then Paul says, baby is crying. So he's able to use the ing, which we use in English, as a way to show that, Paul not only understands that when he says right, I am actively doing something, that we say ing on the end, that when he refers to someone else in a different scenario, in an entirely different subject, Paul is actually able to transfer that skill to another area as well. So those are very key elements of language learning that we all want, and that should be ideally implemented into our understanding of language learning. So that is kind of an example of how that is done in the classroom. Some other aspects that I think are important, this is done in both colleges and different learning scenarios. So one of the areas of a study that I did was a study done by a guy named Patrick, and the article, the piece of research, was called Comprehensible Input and Krashen's Theory, and it appeared in the Journal of Classics. So classics typically being Latin and ancient Greek, and our Patrick was a teacher of Latin, and he had taken a Spanish class where the Spanish class was taught entirely through comprehensible input. So this was intermediate Spanish, and he was very inspired by the class. So with the Spanish teacher, he goes in, and the Spanish teacher begins using pictures and different slides and acting out scenarios where he discusses things in Spanish, and you acquire the Spanish through this medium. So you're interacting with the teacher. The teacher's asking you questions in Spanish. If you don't understand, he's doing gestures, he's acting things out, and you pick up, you understand what he's communicated, and through that interaction, you develop your skill of speaking Spanish. Well, our Patrick was a classics teacher in Latin, and his idea was, why can't we implement this in the classroom? So he took this same idea, which was interactive comprehensible input, which was what we discussed with Krashen and Long, and he has really dramatically affected the way that he was able to teach Latin. He did this with other Latin professors, and he showed them where they would begin reading a document, they would begin reading something in Latin, and then they were meant to communicate with one another what they had read. Almost virtually the entire classroom at the time of about 100 Latin teachers read this transcript that he gave them, and they were unable to say anything about it because they didn't understand what it had said. So he and another colleague of his spent about an hour with these Latin teachers, and they taught them the vocabulary of it through the means of interaction. So they used pictures, they acted things out, they asked them questions, and they pointed to things, gestured, and as a way of teaching the vocabulary that was used in that. And then after an hour of that, they had them all read the document again. And of course, this is anecdotal, it's just people responding, but the Latin, virtually the entire class was able to corroborate that their comprehension, their understanding of what they read after that was dramatically higher. They actually understood the text. So that kind of is a case study, I guess. All of those actually are case studies that demonstrate the importance and the success that can be achieved through the means of not only comprehensible input, but comprehensible input through interaction. So one good question that one might ask then is, how does this work as far as like a classroom if you're an ESL teacher? And Krashen's comprehensible input lays the basic groundwork for that, but understanding in a second language. But Long's interaction hypothesis builds that foundation and creates a scenario where as a teacher, you can interact with students. So some of the descriptions that are given in both Long's theory and in Krashen's theories in their papers, their published papers, include having students work together in group projects, with an important key being that the students cannot both have the same L1. They have to have different first languages, and which would necessitate them to rely on their L2, which in this case would be English. So in a classroom, then you could create projects that require students to interact. This could be almost any topic. So you could ask them personal things that they will want to describe, things that they feel comfortable describing about maybe their favorite food, their favorite animal, their favorite activity to do, their favorite games, what kinds of sports they like, anything like that requires or or facilitates the students in speaking with one another. And then, of course, as the same classroom topics that I described before as R. Patrick in the Latin class, that method would be applicable in a classroom like this as well, assuming that the subject matter is on an appropriate grade level, which will range depending on what grade level you're teaching, this case being K through 12. So that is all, and I hope that you guys enjoyed the video. Hopefully we all have a little bit more understanding about not only comprehensible input, but how best is sometimes utilized with interaction in the topic of comprehensible input. You guys take it easy, and I will talk to you in another video coming soon.